The money supply shrinking is going to bring inflation to its knees, and I think we're going to see a period here, potentially a brief period, of deflation. Here we are, beautiful Mexico City. So much is happening in the world. We thought we'd take a break and just talk about some of the geopolitical events that have taken place as it relates to the US.
Let's get into it. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe if you enjoy the pod.
Money supply. We got to start there. This is a huge variable that the Fed is looking at. First contraction since
Great Depression.
Not only that, there was a huge contraction, about 4% in the last quarter, and that's the biggest on record.
What does that? Explain what that means.
So money supply, M2 as it's measured, is the money that's in circulation. Coins, deposits, cash. That's the money that's out there in the US economy that's moving around. And we'll put an exact definition of money supply in the description. You can't overstate the significance of this because the entire US economy is built on the expansion of credit, okay? This is a debt-based monetary system. So for it to grow, credit needs to expand. The money supply shrinking is going to bring inflation to its knees. And I think we're going to see a period here, potentially a brief period, of deflation.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable that with credit contraction, which is happening, it's happening on Main Street's level, with obviously higher rates, harder to get mortgages, lower mortgages, affordability's becoming more and more difficult. I agree, it's going to come. The question is when. And so when you combine a rising rate environment with contracting money supply, which is something we haven't seen to this extent, we haven't seen in our lifetime, I think it could create the perfect storm for asset price depreciation, which is deflation. But it points to a larger issue too, which is and I don't want to over sensationalize it because I know it's everywhere in the news and it's very buzzy to talk about right now, the downfall of the dollar and the downfall of the US. But there's no doubt in my mind, economically and geopolitically, the U.S. is on the decline. Can it stop that decline? Depends on the power of the U.S. consumer.
Everyone knows that the U.S. has been spending more than it brings in for decades, right? Like when was the last budget surplus? Clinton?
2001, it was 20 years ago.
Okay, early 2000s. So the stakes have just gotten extremely high with inflation and with the debt at where it's at, right? The debt to GDP is the highest it's been since World War II. It's above 125% now.
And that's just government debt. Never mind the fact that credit card debt continually goes to new all-time highs.
Mortgage
I think
debt.
70% of America now is living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah. Over 70% of Americans are financially stressed. That's a recent survey came out and showed that.
So you combine that with contracting money supply, higher rates, inflation, and I think it's a perfect storm for America to enter a pretty significant recession at a time when China's making moves globally, and you now have 19 countries applying to enter the BRICS. Now, does that mean that the world's going to go off the US dollar anytime soon? No, probably not for the next 10, 20 years. But does that mean that the yuan gains influence globally? 1,000%. Just last week, Argentina agreed that they will now purchase imports from China with the yuan, where they had been settling in dollars for decades.
Again, history repeats itself, okay? So we kind of go back to the 40s. The money supply exploded from like 6 billion to 25 billion, okay? It went crazy. Prior to that, there was almost no money supply growth. The war, things went just absolutely nuts. Inflation started picking up after the war. It's just like the pandemic and all the spending that happened. It took about a year and a half, 2 years. By 1947, inflation was jamming, 15%, 16%, okay? Price controls came in, inflation came off, but then it ramped right back up in 1949 to 10%. The money, even this 4% decrease is nothing, okay? The money supply didn't increase like it did in the 40s, but it still went up astronomically. But I'm expecting we're gonna see, it's not gonna be, it's not just gonna cruise down to 2% and stay there. We might have 6 months of
waves,
disinflation and even dip into, but what I'm trying to say, looking back at the 40s, it went to 15, 16%. In 47, by 1949, it was deflation, 2% deflation.
Wow.
Yes. So that can happen, and then it came right back up. So I think the U.S. is in a similar situation where people are putting the brakes on a lot of things. The money supply is contracting. Everyone's tight. Everyone is super tight for cash. Inflation is wreaking absolute havoc on household balance sheets.
And the federal government's balance sheets too. And it doesn't really matter.
No.
It doesn't really matter. It's probably going to be Biden versus Trump again. There's no difference from a spending perspective between the two. The difference is where they put the money. Trump ran $1 trillion deficit in 3% growth.
Yeah.
Look, okay?
Yeah.
So it doesn't really matter who
No,
wins.
but
And now you have a country that's fighting.
Biden's deficits will be significantly larger than Trump's.
We'll
Okay.
see. But my point is this.
The
You have a
congressional-
country that's putting on theatrics about arguing over a debt ceiling. We all know the debt ceiling will be negotiated. And then next year we have an election. Whether Biden wins or Trump wins, there's going to be deficit spending.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. They haven't had a surplus in 20 years. The economy's slowing. It's at like 1.1% right now. Let's say Trump gets it back up, fine. But servicing their debt now is so much more expensive than it was when he was running the country. And still, he ran near $1 trillion deficit.
The debt ceiling came in shortly after the U.S. entered World War I, 1917, around there, 1917, 1918. And it was, again, supposed to be temporary, never left. They kept increasing it. The Congressional Budget Office has forecasted a $1.5 trillion deficit in 2023 under Biden. Beyond that, looking out 10 years, from 2024 to 2033, Congressional Budget Office of the United States is forecasting an average of $2 trillion deficits every year in the US going forward for 10 years. There is one way and one way only out of this potential currency crisis, banking crisis, debt crisis, and that's inflation. Without inflation, the US defaults on its debt and the debt to GDP ratio goes to 200, 300%, whatever you want to call it. They need that inflation every year to erode the real value of the 33 trillion or whatever the debt is at currently to get that ratio back down. There's no other way around it. They have to go to inflation. How they're going to do that and manage the populace where you've got over 70% struggling and stressing out financially, I don't know.
Well, I think inevitably it's going to lead to some sort of universal income. But what is the
It's going to
consequence?
lead to price controls too, yeah.
And what is the consequence of all this? Their financial house is not in order.
No.
So their global influence will decline.
This is it.
In trade, in military presence, and political influence. Yes, it's not going to happen overnight. And yes, they're still the superpower of the world. But there's so many cracks in their foundation now that have been exposed. It's no longer fringe theory.
Exactly. You were saying at the beginning, right? Like the de-dollarization, buzzword everyone likes to run around, and it's not going to happen tomorrow or next week. But from a technical standpoint, you have to look at the US dollar index very carefully, especially if you're a precious metals investor, because you're seeing it roll over, right? It peaked at about 114 last year. It's down to 101. It goes to 100. The next stop is 90. And, if it goes through there, look out. The bull market in gold that we saw, the first peak in 2011.
Yeah,
above
with the debt ceiling.
With the debt ceiling crisis showdown.
Which is all theatrics. It's all theatrics.
All theatrics. But if you look at the dollar index, it was down in the low 70s back then. So we're still above 100 and gold's above 2,000. Where do you think gold's going if the US dollar index drops to 70?
Even if it drops in the 80s, mid 80s, I think gold has a very good shot of being at $2,500 an ounce.
The days of just kind of like running to the dollar and sitting there, I think, are over. It's going to be a world reserve currency for a long time, but there's only safety and diversification.
And just keep in mind that the reason China is pushing and the BRICS are becoming so appealing, it is rumored that they want to create a gold-backed currency. That is one of the chief reasons many countries want to be involved. Outside of the fact that the US is losing its influence, perhaps might not be the largest market in the world in 10, 15 years. That is why countries are enticed to join the BRICS. All I need to see to understand China's growing influence globally and America's declining influence, all I need to see is one thing. What China did to bring Iran and Saudi together. These are
sworn enemies
dating back decades.
But 2019, the Saudis, one of their biggest oil refactories, gets blown up. The U.S. doesn't do anything. The Saudis are standing there. They're looking around. They've gone to Beijing. They're looking now to Beijing for protection. They see Beijing as a rising power, and they see the U.S. as a fading power. And you're absolutely right. Xi was able to bring both those leaders together in Beijing to sign a peace treaty. And it just so happens, that those are two of the largest producers and exporters of oil in the world, both of them China. So China has really secured its energy independence for generations, arguably, if these peace deals can hold. Not only that, China's building a huge new oil refinery in China, one of the biggest, most advanced oil refineries in the world. Whereas other countries are shutting them down, China's building new ones.
Yeah, and coal plants, nuclear, etc. But what would expedite China's rise, I guess, and speed up America's decline is very simple. If China can go in and somehow seem like a peacemaker with Ukraine and Russia. No, I don't think it's going to happen, but if it did, all bets are off. Everything speeds up, probably by an order
10
of
years.
magnitude. All right, I think that about wraps it up. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Take care.